All right, today we're going to dive into one of history's greatest underdog stories, for sure, the American Revolution. I mean, think about it. This is the story of how a handful of colonies, really just armed with a powerful idea, went head-to-head with a global superpower, and somehow they won.
And that's really the big question, isn't it? How on earth does a colony, any colony, defeat a global superpower? I mean, how did this scattered, underfunded group of colonists manage to take on and beat the most powerful military on the entire planet? Well, the answer isn't simple. It's this incredible mix of bold principles, really smart politics, and, yeah, a healthy dose of luck.
You know, the story starts in a place you might not expect. It's not with rebellion. It's actually with an alliance. Britain and its American colonies had just fought side by side, as allies. But ironically, the very victory they shared is what would end up tearing them apart.
So the root of the problem really comes down to money. It's the cost of victory. See, Britain had just won this massive global war against France, and with it they secured control in North America. Huge win! But winning came at a staggering price. The empire was just buried in debt. And Parliament, over at London, they had a pretty simple solution for who should help pay for it all. You guessed it, the American colonies.
Okay, and this is where the conflict really, truly ignites. From Britain's point of view, they just thought they were asking the colonies to pay their fair share. Simple enough, right? But for the colonists, this was never really about the money. It was about something much, much bigger. It was about a fundamental principle of liberty.
And man, things escalated quickly. Let's just look at the timeline here. In 1765, you've got the Stamp Act, which taxed pretty much every piece of printed paper. Then, just a couple years later, the Townshend Acts taxed all these essential imported goods. And then you get to the Tea Act in 73, which, get this, wasn't even really about raising money. It was a political trick, a maneuver designed to basically force the colonists to accept that Parliament had the right to tax them. It was just one provocation after another.
So, the colonists' response to all this? Well, it could be boiled down to a single, incredibly powerful phrase. But you gotta understand, this wasn't just some catchy slogan for a protest sign. This was the absolute core of their entire legal and philosophical argument against what Britain was doing.
And here's the crucial point, right here. The colonists saw themselves as Englishmen, period. And that meant they were entitled to all the rights of Englishmen. One of the most fundamental of those rights was that you couldn't be taxed unless you had a voice, representation in the government that was taxing you. And since they didn't elect a single member to Parliament in London, they argued that Parliament had zero legal right to take their money. For them, it was just that straightforward.
Well, it wasn't long before words turned into action. Things got serious. You have the Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers fired on a crowd and killed 5 civilians. That became powerful propaganda, of course. Then, in response to the Tea Act, you get the famous and pretty dramatic Boston Tea Party. But Britain's reaction to that, what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, that's what really went too far. By literally shutting down Boston's entire local government, Britain basically proved to every other colony that their own self-rule was at risk too.
So let's move to the next phase, because this is where protest officially becomes war. The famous shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord in 1775, that was the point of no return. But you have to remember, on paper, this looked like a completely unwinnable fight for the Americans, a real David versus Goliath situation.
Now, the colonists weren't entirely alone. This whole thing very quickly became a global affair. You had France, Spain, and the Netherlands, all big rivals of Britain, and they eventually joined the American cause. But on the other side, wow, Great Britain had the world's most professional army. On top of that, they had German mercenaries, the famous Hessians, plus American loyalists. Those were colonists who stayed loyal to the king, and some Native American allies as well. And let me tell you, those early years of the war were just brutal. Absolutely brutal for the Americans. General George Washington was leading the Continental Army, this newly formed patriot force that was honestly more of a ragtag militia than a real professional military. They were constantly short on food, on supplies, on training, and they just lost battle after battle against the super disciplined British forces. But everything changed in one single year, 1777. This was the year the entire momentum of the war just completely shifted, all thanks to a single, absolutely stunning victory.
And that victory was the Battle of Saratoga. It was a massive gamble that paid off big time. The Continental Army somehow managed to surround and capture an entire British army. Now, this wasn't some small skirmish in the woods. This was a major, conventional, open-field victory that sent shockwaves all the way across the Atlantic. And what's most important is that it gave France the confidence it needed to finally formally declare war on Britain and become an official American ally. That was the game changer.
And that French alliance, it led directly to this moment right here, the final act of the war. The main British army down in the south, led by Lord Cornwallis, they marched to the coast of Virginia to a little town called Yorktown. They were basically expecting to get resupplied or maybe evacuated by the Royal Navy.
But this is where the strategy became just a brilliant trap. Washington takes his American army and the French army, and they march hundreds of miles south with incredible speed. They get to Yorktown and immediately seal off the peninsula, trapping Cornwallis's entire army by land. But the decisive blow, the real checkmate, came at sea. The French Navy sailed up from the Caribbean and actually defeated the British fleet right off the coast in the Battle of the Chesapeake. That naval victory, that was the final nail in the coffin. It meant no supplies could get in and no soldiers could get out. Cornwallis was completely and totally trapped. He had no choice but to surrender, and that effectively ended the war for independence. But listen, winning the war, that was only half the battle. Now came the even harder part, creating a country completely from scratch. You could almost call this the Second Revolution, and maybe the more difficult one. And you know what? They didn't get it right on the first try. Not even close. Their first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, created a central government that was so weak it couldn't even collect taxes to pay off its own war debts. It was a total failure. So the founders had to go back to the drawing board, and that's when they created the Constitution, this radical new blueprint for a government. And to get it passed, they had to promise to add a Bill of Rights, to make sure those individual liberties they had just fought a war for were protected.
And at the very heart of this new constitution was a brilliant idea, one designed specifically to prevent the rise of another king, the separation of powers. They split the government into three co-equal branches. You've got the legislative branch, Congress, that makes the laws, the executive, the president, who enforces them, and the judicial, the Supreme Court, which interprets them. With this whole system of checks and balances, no single part of the government could ever become all-powerful.
Of course, we can't forget the idea that really started it all. This powerful phrase from the Declaration of Independence. That was the moral and the philosophical fuel for the entire revolution. It was this incredible promise of a new kind of nation, one founded not on blood or soil, but on a universal ideal of human liberty.
So that brings us to the end. I mean, what a journey, right? From a simple tax protest to a brand new nation, all fueled by these radical ideas of liberty and self-government. And that kind of leaves us with a big question to think about. Of all the principles and structures the founders created, what do you think is the single most important idea that we've inherited from them today? It's something to chew on. Thanks for joining me for this one.